Welcome to another Ideas That Matter conversation. I'm very happy to have here Professor Sara Uckelman, who currently is at Durham University, but she's been around quite a few places, including here in our native land of Wisconsin, where she got her master's at University of Wisconsin-Madison in philosophy, and went to University of Amsterdam, did a PhD in logic there. And have you been at any other, did you go straight to Durham or did you go to any other places?
No, okay. I had a postdoc in Amsterdam and then one at the University of Tilburg, which is another place in the Netherlands, and then the University of Heidelberg in Germany.
Oh, wow.
And came to Durham. Yep.
Yeah, well, it sounds like a good place to be. So you're professor of logic and philosophy of language, which I think so part of what we'll talk about in here is how logic is probably not restricted to the formal logic that people might have encountered in undergraduate critical thinking or logic or whatever other courses. I suppose part of an intro to philosophy class usually has a chapter and you spend 1 week on doing a little bit of logic as well. So before we launch off on that point, so I do want to mention the YouTube channel. So I think that is how we probably wound up interacting, because you've been posting really helpful videos in logic and related topics for about 4 years now. Interestingly titled Dr. Logic Awkwardly Does Logic. I'll have to ask you about what is the origin of that. But you also have this Diary of Dr. Logic blog, which I think a lot of people probably don't know about. And that's quite interesting as well. And I suppose gives people a much better understanding about how broad the range of your interests are, and maybe is a little bit of pulling the curtain away. I should mention, so you do a lot of things with logic and philosophy of language, obviously, and you've held some important posts, like with the British Logic Colloquium, being the vice president. You're the associate editor of the Journal of Logic, Language, and Information, although you haven't been doing that since 2020, but you're also, I think a lot of people don't have any idea of this, you're also very interested in and contributing to the world of speculative fiction. So I think a lot of people will want to know how these matters are connected together, and not just in, say, the people who used to write about logic in clearly magical ways like A. Van Vogt, or you think of those Complete Enchanter novels way back in the day, where arranging logic in your head took you to a different world. But so how did, actually, let's start out here. So how did these seemingly quite different areas of interest wind up coming together for you? I'm imagining it's not a compartmentalized life where you got your logic over here and you just do that, and then you've got your speculative fiction interests over here. How did they wind up coalescing in the same person?
Yeah, so definitely there is no compartmentalization going on. I gave up trying to have different separate facets of my life decades ago. We can actually talk a bit about that if we talk about the topic of my dissertation, because that actually was another instance of two previously seemingly disparate parts of my life colliding and resulting in a PhD dissertation. But I have been reading and writing stories basically since as long as I can remember. I learned to read shortly after I turned 4, and the first stories that I was picking out on my parents' Osborne computer date from not much long after that. So I have been writing for pretty much all of my life, and I'd always known that I was going to be a writer. This was one of kind of my earliest identities. And this is partly why when I went off to university, I studied English literature. I loved reading. I wanted to write books and everything and all of this. And in kind of my undergraduate period, I came to the realization that I really like reading, but I don't necessarily want to write term papers about what I am reading. And also, while I'm a pretty good writer, I was also, I had the maturity to recognize that I was not actually a good writer. And so kind of a lot of my fiction work kind of paused for a bit, while simultaneously I had taken, a couple years earlier, I had taken my first logic class, and it was cool and fun. And then I took my next one, and the next one, and the next one. And then all of a sudden I ended up with a PhD in logic because I just kept wanting to do more. So for a period, it was kind of, there wasn't much intersection, though when I was doing kind of like non-logic philosophy, I was particularly interested in questions that fiction raises. So there's a lot of, very kind of traditional questions about what grounds the truth of statements about fictional objects. How do we talk about them? What are these objects? Various sorts of kind of questions in philosophy of language intersected with fiction in interesting ways. So there was always kind of that. But as I said, I sort of stopped writing fiction around about the end of my undergraduate, partly because I realized, as I said, I wasn't quite as good as I wanted to be, but also I was getting so wrapped up in the logic and stuff, and spent a good decade, writing a dissertation, writing papers, writing, lots of writing, even if it was all nonfiction. And then, gosh, about 10 years ago now, one day I woke up and was like, I want to start writing stories again. And I did, and realized, you know what? All of that time that I spent writing about logic and working in logic was exactly what I needed to fill in the gaps that I had been missing. Logic provides me with scope for how to put a story together rather than just how to put words together. So all of a sudden I had this really kind of intimate link between the two.
Yeah, that makes sense. Particularly when, as we're going to talk about again, logic isn't just understood as formal propositional logic, the kind of stuff that we do and then maybe do a few proofs about, and then the class is over. I'm reminded when I was an undergraduate, I majored in philosophy and mathematics, and I wound up getting into both in a similar way to what you described, where I took a class, they threw me into Calc 1, and I was fortunate in that the guy who was teaching it was really into theory. So he introduced the theory of limits, and I was like, holy crap, math was never like this before. And I just kept taking classes and eventually wound up, doing a major. And with philosophy, I just kind of picked it out of a list of things and said, that sounds cool, I'll take classes in it. And I also hung out with the literature types, and I wrote poetry and short stories back then. And I think I stopped for a similar reason. I realized I'm not good enough for this to be really worth my time on my part. But I went to this writing teacher who I really liked, and he was kind of typical boomer poetry guy, dressing in flannel and, talking about how everybody's a fake and stuff like that. And the students in his class, the writing students, they feared him because of his criticism. And I just audited the classes so I could have fun in them. And I went to his office one day and I said, I think I'd like to change my major from philosophy to writing. And he said, oh, that's a terrible idea. And at first I thought he was going to say, because you suck and you've got no talent and, you're just like all the rest of these kids that I don't like. But he actually said this, and I'd be interested to get your take on it, especially given your remark about having studied the logic stuff for so long and written about it. It put you in a better place to write. So he said, two things. One was he was criticizing the writers of his time, including these students. These like, they're all so precious. They're writing about writing, all this meta stuff, very self-conscious, and they haven't actually lived. And then when they have, they're just writing about like their latest romance or getting drunk or, you know, something like that. And it's all very boring. And then he said, you need to stick with philosophy because at least then you're going to have something interesting to write about, not all this silly nonsense about your own boring life. And so it's like, oh, okay. He's actually trying to look out for me here. He's not brushing me off. And I just followed his advice and stuck with the philosophy stuff. But I did want to be a writer, at the same time. So we'll come back to these other topics. When we want to be a writer, what the hell do we actually want with that? Is it just like a kind of mythological figure, or we think it'll be like many people picture philosophy? We'll just sit around and read books and write all day and it'll be so cool. What is it we're actually after?
Yeah. So it is very interesting. I think with my English degree, one thing that I definitely got out of that, which benefited my writing, was exposure to a wide range of stories and story structures and uses of language and all of that. So like everything that I read during my English degree, I'm very grateful for, because it broadened my horizons and introduced me to new things. I am not sure that a single thing that I ever learned about the books actually had any positive impact on anything that I've written. So definitely I kind of support the philosophy has fed more into what I write than anything that I ever learned in an English class. This is partly because, and this is why I'm so interested in speculative fiction. So I use this rather than trying to kind of pinpoint a particular genre, because everybody always wants to know, oh, you write, what genre do you write?
Yeah.
I have like philosophical qualms about genre as an ontological category, which make this difficult. But speculative fiction is a good umbrella because it's basically, it's all of the stories that allow you to play with various what ifs. What if we could travel faster than light? What if personal identity had this particular flavor? What if? And in a sense, this is also exactly what philosophy is doing. It's asking all of these what if questions. What if the world were like this? What if we could know things in this way? What if this were the correct moral code to act by? And so stories are just, they're just another way of engaging with all of these things. And the very tools that you use in philosophy to be like, okay, here are my starting points. What are the consequences of my theory?
Yeah.
This is how world building works in a speculative fiction world. It's like you put and you can have a very detailed set of axioms, or you can have just one or two and a couple of rules of inference that tell you how to interpret these axioms. But then everything that you do is kind of within the confines of what you have started off with. And this is why being able to engage with the logical structure of things was so useful, because it kind of directed me towards the right sorts of questions to be asking when I'm writing. As for the question, like what is it that we want when we say that, we want to be a writer? For me, it was definitely very much that I want to be a writer, which is not necessarily the same as being an author. Okay. I am an author. I've got some short stories out there. Like every other lapsed English major, I've got a novel draft in the drawer. But that was never the goal. For me, writing satisfies a need like deep in my soul that nothing else does. It often in like a very physical way. So when I haven't been able to do much writing, either because of time or other pressures, or more recently, I found kind of the COVID pandemic a really, really difficult time to work through. And it's like, I want to be writing and I'm not able to. And it just kind of hurts after a while. So, why do I want to be a writer? I want to get that pain out.
And as a writer, when you talk about that need to write, let's say here's a what if. Well, actually, here's two what ifs. So one is you write, but almost nobody is going to read what you've written. It's still valuable, right? And you still get the same charge. And you could ask, well, then why show it to anybody? Well, because there's also something that comes with that. And then here's a follow-up to that. What if like everything? So I'm assuming that your writing is backed up in multiple places because we've all had the experience of losing something by this point that we shouldn't have. Usually it's only like a day of work, but sometimes it could be something pretty massive. Now imagine that everything that you've written has disappeared, and you don't. People sometimes think of writers as like having it all up in their head, but that's definitely not the case. It's still, there's still value in having written, right? And so what is that?
So when I talk with other people, particularly students, about writing, there's a lot of advice to writers out there, and it's all along the lines of like, write every day, set yourself goals, particular word counts, all of these things. And essentially, as with any sort of advice, if it works for you, take it. If it doesn't, junk it. But one thing that I find happens with this kind of advice, which otherwise might be useful for people, is that sometimes people can get into this mindset of like only real writing counts, and that if you're writing every day, it has to be real writing. It has to be writing on your novel draft or something. And I really want to push back against this with the idea that all writing is real writing. So if I am drafting a blog post, or if I'm writing a referee report, or if I'm working on a grant application, or if I'm drafting a journal article, or if I'm writing a poem, all of these are legitimate ways of writing. And in fact, I'm super into like stats and numbers and things. And so I track how many words I write, and I've got 4 categories that they go into. And by now I've got like 8 years worth of data of what I have written in how many words in which categories on which days. And the reason, if all of my writing disappeared, yes, this would be sad. However, all of the experience that I have gotten from writing, figuring out what order do I put the ideas in? What does the reader need to know here before I move on to here? What are the right ways of putting a sentence together so that it just sings? All of that still remains. The more you do this, the more you learn, the easier it becomes. And so this is why, I always want, particularly students who can get themselves into these binds where they're like, oh, but I have to be doing, it has to be real. And I'm like, no, but it's all real. The 800-word blog post is one of my favorite venues for working out ideas, because it's only like 800 words. No one's going to read the blog post, so I don't have to say anything super insightful. I don't even have to have an argument. I can just be like, I read this paper. Here's some interesting things. And the number of times that like 2 or 3 years later, I've gone back to one of those blog posts, sucked it up, dumped it into another file, and been like, and now I've got the start of a paper.
Ooh, that's an interesting point. And so this is a bit of a tangent, but I'd be interested to get your take on this. So it's the beginning of the semester here, as I imagine it is over by you as well. So, first day is syllabus day, and we talk about all these things. And there's always like an academic dishonesty part of the syllabus. And at one of the places that I teach, they have sort of a boilerplate thing for that, and it includes self-plagiarism. And I tell my students in my classes, I'm never going to care if you self-plagiarize, and I find it really weird. And so it's actually an Institute of Art and Design, and they should be doing creative work, but rigorous work and all that. And I think to myself, well, what do you do when you're building a portfolio? You're not trying to generate radically different, new, never been done before by anyone, let alone you, products. You naturally build. I mean, every craft is like this, right? Imagine if in music you had to like come up with all your own scales or something. It would be ridiculous. You'd never get anywhere. And so we tell these students while they're in college, oh, it's a bad thing for you to be taking your previous work that you did for a grade in another class where presumably you actually cared about what you were doing. It's a bad thing for you to recycle that. And I want to say it's exactly the opposite. How do we actually get good at things? We build up a repertoire. And you can, here's a segue into something like logic, at least dialectic. In ancient times, you see people like Aristotle and Cicero talking about that as building. I mean, Cicero's term is copia, but the whole notion of the topoi, building them up, having them available for you so that you don't have to like reinvent the wheel every time you want to do something a little bit different. So first off, does your university actually have any position on self-plagiarizing? And then second, what's your take on this building process?
Yeah. So I mean, my institution has restrictions on self-plagiarism because we've got Turnitin like everybody else does. It's very easy to find out, have you submitted this paper for another class? I think that the issue with self-plagiarism, which I understand why it's called self-plagiarism, but I think that it kind of muddies the waters as to what it is about, because it's not taking someone else's ideas or words and passing them off as your own, as kind of plagiarism is. What it is essentially taking your effort and passing it off as new. And in the context of education, I can understand how you want to make it the case that people have to generate kind of appropriate amounts of work for a particular assessment thing. So like taking a paper that you wrote for another class and just resubmitting it for a second class does strike me as problematic from an educational perspective, not necessarily from a plagiarism perspective.
Yeah.
What my university, or at least my department, does, which I think is really excellent, is every student has to write a 12,000-word thesis in their final year. And this is their opportunity to develop their own research questions, to build on ideas that maybe they haven't had a chance to write about in class. But some of them will often come and be like, I actually wrote on this topic in second year, really enjoyed it, really loved it, was constrained by the word count, didn't get to say everything I wanted to say. I really want to work on this. How do I do this without it being self-plagiarism? And in that case, it's actually quite straightforward, because if you're moving from a 3,000-word paper to a 12,000-word dissertation, you're going to have to rewrite. You're going to have to, the bit that you wrote in 3,000 words cannot be placed into a larger piece unchanged. So you've got to engage with it. And what we just tell students is, if you are going to be kind of building on ideas that you have already developed in an earlier paper, you do the same thing that you do to prevent ordinary plagiarism, which is cite your sources. Tell the person who is grading your dissertation, this work builds on ideas that were first developed in this paper that I wrote for this class in this year with this teacher. And I think that really kind of addresses the issue of, we don't want people to essentially get double credit for one piece of work. I think that we should, as educators, we really should be looking for ways to get students to do exactly this sort of thing, just to start small, to simmer, to think about things, to expand on it. You're absolutely right. We don't ask people to reinvent the wheel. Not everybody has to have entirely new ideas for everything. It is just as valuable to be able to delve into something that you looked at maybe on a more superficial level and really deepen it. And I would love it to be possible to have more opportunities to do that kind of thing in the educational setting because it's such a useful skill when you move outside.
Yeah, I suppose in the way most of our colleges and universities arrange curricula now, where it tends to be that you've got like a core of some sort, but it's been, narrowed and narrowed and narrowed. And then you've got like, your major areas that you're actually working in, which may be coherent or may be just kind of a hot mess of different things that are all thrown together. There's not that many opportunities for doing that, it would have to be other sorts of writing, I suppose. So, let's say a student does get interested in writing short stories and they're honing them, and occasionally they can submit them to a writing class that they're taking, or they can weave some of it into some other class somehow. They're not going to get any sort of across the board useful assessment and feedback about it. They'd probably have to like take it to a workshop, right? Or find a club or something like that.
Something kind of extracurricular.
Yeah. There was a point I wanted to come back to about the writing, and particularly writing classes, and the students that are doing that. When it comes to speculative fiction, we can think of like countless people who, before they became professional writers of fiction, they were doing other forms of writing, sometimes making a decent living with it and sometimes not. Some of it could be technical writing, or it could be writing in a different genre, juvenile writing. Think about Heinlein, for example, doing that. Copy editing, all sorts of stuff. And I think
journalism, legal writing.
Right. Yeah. So I think that, maybe they don't get enough examples of, I suppose it also depends on how you frame it, right? You could frame it as, well, I do this to pay the bills kind of writing over here, but this isn't real writing. And then, here's my masterful writing over here that actually counts.
Yeah. I mean, I'm sure that some people do approach it that way, but writing a good story involves so many different facets. You've got to have a good plot. You've got to have, if you're doing something speculative, you've got to have the right kind and the right amount of world building in the background. You've got to have good characters and everything. But fundamentally, you also just have to be able to put words together well. And if you have spent a lifetime doing that, even if it is in an entirely, maybe you are writing technical reports or like market analyses for business and industry or something. If you do this day in and day out for a decade, you will just be better at putting words together. And so this is one reason why I don't think it makes sense to divide the writing into the real writing and what would this be contrasted with? The fake writing? I spent all this time and I've got 600 words on a paper that weren't there an hour ago, but no, this is somehow this weird other thing, which is not real writing. Yeah, I don't even know what it would be.
Well, that's a really interesting question, because as you're talking about it there, so we're thinking about oppositions, right? And how do you define the opposition? So you have to, where the real is, you've got to put in some other qualifier that you can then have opposition to. So real could be opposed to derivative and superficial and that sort of thing. And then real means something like authentic. And there's all sorts of problems with what the hell is that, or it could be based on whether you make any money on it. You've got your money making stuff over here. And when it comes to our video stuff, right? People will sometimes be like, oh, I'm going to use a compliment that I get, and I think it applies equally to your stuff. Oh, this is, it's not high production, but it's really, they know what they're talking about, and they're approaching it in a way that helps me understand it, and all of that, right? So you can set up oppositions like that. Whereas, the people who are trying to make a buck on it, they've got all sorts of glossy graphics and fades and music, and then they tell you all sorts of stuff that's actually false because they didn't do any research to make their videos, right? So you could be opposing it on pecuniary and a pecuniary axis of value. If it's making money, it's no good. So what is real writing? Real writing is done just for the love of it. And I think we could come up with probably a dozen different oppositions, but you notice
academics, the real writing is going to be that which leads to a publication.
Right.
And so this means that even writing grant applications, which are increasingly super important for academics to do, this doesn't always count for mentally for some people as being real writing. And I guess one thing that I really dislike about the kind of real versus fake dichotomy when it comes to this is that it just sets you up for failure, because you get to the end of the day and you're like, I spent all day working on this grant application and I wrote 1,500 words and really progressing, but I didn't work on that paper draft, so I accomplished nothing. And this is when you are distinguishing between the real words and the fake words, then if you spent all of your time on the fake stuff, even if this is work that needs to be done, work that is valuable, work that puts you closer to being able to do other things that you want to do, you can still come away at the end of the day and feel like I've accomplished nothing. Yeah. And so one thing I like about framing, all words are real words, is that doesn't matter if all I managed to scrape out was 500 words for a blog post. I can come away at the end of the day and be like, I wrote today. Go me.
Would you include a day that is consumed just with emails among that?
It depends. Most emails I don't count the words for.
Okay.
However, there are going to be some where, when you're in the early stages of working out a potential research collaboration with somebody, or a student asks you a question and then you kind of turn around and realize 600 words later, you've got the start of a mini essay. I will sometimes count those. I mean, I have a category which is admin. So it's just kind of things written in the process of doing admin. So that's for referee reports, grant drafts, but emails like that, because again, they fulfill the purpose of providing me opportunities to exercise thinking about how to put ideas together and what are the right words to do so.
Are you finding that there's more receptivity in the academy, which is its own weird kind of world, to considering, and we'll just take philosophy. So, for philosophy, the sort of pinnacle of everything is a great set of journal articles, hopefully in a top tier, however that's defined, journal, that then could be bundled together in a selected essays volume later on down the line when you're, important enough for people to want to purchase. Yeah. And, so there's all sorts of kinds of writings. You mentioned blog posts, blogs have been around for, quite a long time. I would say, much of the time that we've been on the internet, blogs have been out there. And, there's at least from where I sit, there seems to be, at least in some circles, a growing awareness that, one, if we want our discipline to have any impact whatsoever, it's not going to be through writing journal articles or even often, monographs, I'll say, rather than just trade books. And that there is a whole opportunity for writing all sorts of stuff that you don't have a lot of gatekeepers the way we did in the past. If, when I was in college, I suppose if you wanted to get your philosophical views out there and you didn't want to go to a journal to try to do so, you could write up your own thing on your primitive computer and print it out on dot matrix and then, I don't know, send it to people or hammer it on a wall or something. But now, anybody can get into the game. There's all these platforms where people do interesting writing, some of them quite old, and almost ready to collapse. And then a lot of them are coming out every single year. So, and let me actually like broaden this too, because you do so much video work, and valuable video work that's, rigorous and systematic and showing people how to understand a vast variety of topics in logic and language and things like that. And I'm not asking like, does that count for tenure? Because that's a whole other can of worms. But do you get a sense among colleagues that they view this stuff as mattering, not just being a kind of dilettantism, or it's for people who can't do the real rigorous stuff,
Yeah. It's really interesting because, so, what you were saying about kind of the pinnacle being, the top tier journal article.
Yeah.
I would even go so far as to say that within academic philosophy, the pinnacle is the monograph with Oxford University Press or Cambridge University.
Yes.
This is when you know that you have made it. And if you only have top tier journal articles, are you really, a top flight philosopher? There is a lot of that still in the discipline, particularly when it comes to hiring committees. Getting hiring committees to think outside of that very narrow conception about what we are going to count as good philosophy or being a good philosopher is very difficult. Outside of that, I think that there is definitely kind of a growing recognition of the diversity of ways that philosophy can be done, but also the value of doing these ways. So writing philosophical short stories that are accessible to anybody who likes speculative fiction, who can read and enjoy these things, and then start thinking about philosophy in public lectures or YouTube videos or podcasts or all of these things. There is definitely kind of been a change in the discipline in the last decade where these are not so much looked down upon, that they are kind of viewed as genuine contributions. But it is still interesting because often they are like good, genuine contributions, but not necessarily as like philosophical outputs in the way that the journal article and the monograph are. What they are, it's like they have value for public engagement and impact and all of these sorts of buzzwords, which, I mean, that's good that we recognize that it's important for philosophers to look outside of ourselves and to talk to people outside of our discipline. But I think that there's still scope to go further and recognize that this isn't just like making philosophy popular and, kind of dumbing it down to other audiences or putting it into little sound bites, TikTok philosophy, that sort of thing. But that this is kind of like genuinely doing philosophy, not just a way of disseminating it.
Yeah.
We still have ways to go with that.
I'm sympathetic to that notion that there's a third thing there, and I think we have models for it. Somebody who comes to mind right away is Philip K. Dick, who, lots of references to both philosophy and psychology in his works. Unfortunately, a lot of the psychology is now kind of outmoded. Nobody talks about schizoids anymore, but, you can sort of like read back into what he's talking about. And it's interesting because he'll have characters who are talking about Kant or somebody else, and they're not getting it quite right either, right? And if it was just I'm going to pepper or season my novels with some philosophy, or do it in a didactic way, I'm going to present philosophical ideas in a way that can get it across to all those dummies who don't read philosophy but are willing to read pulp science fiction or something like that. You would expect him to actually get it right, but instead he plays with the ideas. And I personally think, and I think there's many other authors out there doing this, that sometimes placing it into a narrative setting with those things that you were talking about before, character, plot, working out what Aristotle would call their thoughts in the dianoia in the Poetics, that we get to see aspects of a philosophical position that we probably would never have dreamed of just reading, say, so think about Kant's Critique of Pure Reason, right?
Mm-hmm.
Dick doesn't refer to it by name, but he talks about the sort of metaphysics and epistemology that is involved with that in terms of space and time, whether they're real or not in any sense, or whether they're partly constituted by the subject. But he does so in ways that I don't think you'd ever get out of just reading the critique by itself.
Yeah.
I mean, who else would you say is really doing a good job with it?
Well, not a specific person, but kind of a genre that I have been reading in translation quite a bit, and that's a lot of the wuxia and zhanxia. So kind of like Chinese sword and sorcery fantasy in a very crude sort of description of it. But one of the things that I've really enjoyed about reading a bunch of these, first of all, they're like, 6, 7, 8, 10 volumes long. And so they last a long time, which is something I appreciate in my reading material. But the background Buddhist, Taoist, Confucian views that are in them, first of all, as a Western reader, I find this just a very different sort of kind of fundamental approach to interaction with the world from what you get in a lot of Western fantasy, and which is very, very medieval European, and as a result, even if they don't admit it, very Christian.
Yeah.
So I find that interesting, but it's not just kind of here's a different worldview, but you really get to see like how it impacts on the characters. And when you have characters who are from like the different schools, and what does this have to say about very central sorts of questions that make literature engaging? Like how do I grapple with failure in the face of something where I feel like I should have had agency to act? Or how do we understand kind of social and political contexts where it is kind of relationships between people that are centered rather than, say, like individual rights? So I don't think if I went and like read the classical Chinese philosophers that I would be able to get much out of it because of differences in background assumptions, differences in language and translation and transmission and all of the cultural assumptions and everything. But I now want to go back and read some of these things, having read all of the fiction, and feeling like, okay, I think I know what sort of things I would be looking for that would then kind of feed back into my enjoyment of the reading. And so there's this really kind of interesting sort of dynamic going on with that.
I've got an idea that I'd like to kick around with you a little bit, and it ties together world building and sort of philosophical depth. But you also mentioned like length, having a 10-volume thing. So I'm shooting video actually a little bit later today, finishing up one on book 5 and 6 of Stephen Erickson's Malazan Book of the Fallen, which, each single volume is like anywhere from a short one is 600 pages, a standard one is 800 pages, long ones are about over 1,000 pages. And it gets described as epic fantasy, and he's actually written a good bit or said a lot in interviews about how do you frame yourself in relation to other epic fantasy, is Tolkien in the background, and he's got a very interesting reason why he bypassed Tolkien and got more into the swords and sorcery kind of stuff like Howard and all of that. And I was thinking, the word epic fantasy at a certain point, it's not the right word anymore. And I don't want to call it super epic or meta epic or something like that. But when you have this sort of scale, there's something, if they're able to pull it off And I think that takes an awful lot to do. And he's talked about the struggle of like keeping all of his characters straight in his head, and
Oh
he
yeah.
puts it all on paper. But when you're able to tell a narrative and you're not losing track of the importance of all these little characters, and it still has grand themes, and you can unfold it from volume to volume to volume. It's not like in the beginning there was this and that, and now everything kind of follows with a clockwork regularity, but there's all these additional reveals that are happening, and there's no one like authorial point of view that straightens everything out for us. I think that something new has arrived. But perhaps it's not that new. You know, I remember my Chinese students when I used to tutor a lot of Chinese students when I was an undergraduate, and they would tell me about, how they would prep for studying for history exams because, we have 300 or so years of history that we get taught in American history.
Yeah.
It starts out with like a couple nods to Native Americans, and then, the Pilgrims show up, and then it goes from there. And, their history goes back millennia, and they're supposed to actually learn it. And you're like, well, how in the hell do you do that? Well, you study it over 5 years, whereas we do all of our American history in just 1 year because not that much history. And the way that they would prep for this, there were shows that they would watch, and they were about all these different historical periods and people, and they were dramatizations of like famous things that had happened. And so they'd watch these, and this would help it like stick in their head. And, I don't want to say anything bad about that because I don't think I could keep all that stuff in my head, even when I was much better at doing that sort of thing when I was young. Right.
Yeah.
And so, maybe this, like, whatever you want to call it, super epic, again, just doesn't really work because then somebody will come along and turn it into super, super epic or something like that. But I think that there's a qualitative difference between that and what we get in, say, Lord of the Rings plus The Hobbit plus The Silmarillion, or Le Guin's Earthsea, or Zelazny's 10-book Amber series, where the books are only this thick,
Yeah.
So how do you have first of all, do you think that there is a qualitative difference between like one kind of epic and then something greater than epic based on these sorts of criteria? And then, I mean, do you have any idea how to talk reasonably about that?
Yeah. So I think that there is definitely something that sets apart these like super mega epics, which is more than just quantitative. It's not just that the story is longer. So I've got kind of two things that came to mind while we were talking. One is, so the like super epic fantasy series that I know and love the most is Robert Jordan's Wheel of Time.
Oh, yeah.
Which again has I think 13 or 14 books, which range from about 700 to 1100 pages long. And in fact, one of the few joys of the early pandemic lockdowns was there was a deserted park nearby that I could take my child to so that she could get some outdoor time, completely socially distanced. And we tried to go out every day, and I would bring a book with me. And so between about April and June of 2020, I reread the entire Wheel of Time from start to finish. It's the second time I've done it cover to cover, and the first time I had done it in that small amount of time. But one of the things that I find really, really remarkable about that as a series is the fact that it's not all written by one person. Robert Jordan died. He knew he was dying. He had extensive notes and manuscripts and directions for somebody to pick it up. And if you read the books, it's very clear that Sanderson is a different writer. The story is paced different. The wording, the language is different. So with the Wheel of Time books, if it had been done badly, then it could really have just entirely fallen apart. But I found it really interesting the first time that I read through all of them, the fact that there was this different voice, this different storyteller towards the end of the story, for me, served to really reinforce essentially how real it felt. Because it suddenly felt like this is actually some real story that is out there. The chronicler has just changed. And this is what we see in history. If you look at, say, like the Anglo-Saxon chronicles, some chronicles write just like a few sentences and some are very verbose, but it's still the same history. So that I think, that I thought was really interesting.
Yeah.
This sense that because it was so large and so massive, and it was possible to bring somebody in to tell the story in a way that didn't try to do it in the same way, really served to reinforce something, that it brought another layer to that series that I think, I mean, it's going to be very rare for another series to have.
I was thinking as you were talking about that transition about Frank Herbert, and then, the getting 6 Dune books out, and then his son turns it into, I mean, what would you call it? Like just a pulp business, let's add new plots and stuff like that. And the consensus seems to be that it just doesn't measure up to the 6 original books, even though it's widened in scope. And that's somebody who presumably should be closer to him, but maybe we can talk about like picking up an ethos or something along those lines where a writer could take over, first of all, if they have the skill of the original writer, and if they can find ways to, as you said, write in a different way, but in a continuity with it. And I think, again, with the Herberts, it seems to be the idea that Frank was good and his son is just not up to snuff. Not terrible, but not first rate.
I think there's also kind of the difference between, like, Sanderson came in knowing that he was writing somebody else's story.
Yeah.
And I don't know kind of the Herbertian psychology as much, but if Herbert version 2 thought that he was writing his own stories, just following on from his father, then that is going to result in kind of it's a different sort of thing.
I think there's
writing somebody else's story is not the same as writing your own.
Yeah, I think there's also the factor of knowing that you're coming in to finish something up, right? To bring it to a successful close, as opposed to like turn it into its own massive universe with its own lore, and who knows when it's going to be done,
The other thing on kind of what you can do with this larger scale storytelling, which I don't think is just a matter of it being longer. So shifting from written fantasy to visual fantasy, I got into reading a bunch of the wuxia and zanxia through dubbed TV series, things like The Untamed and Word of Honor and Alchemy of Souls. So the first 2 are Chinese, the third one is Korean. And this was the first time that I had ever encountered TV of this type. They are, 24 to 42 episodes long. Each episode is 45 minutes to an hour. And so for some of these, it's like longer than your average season in a TV series, but shorter than an entire TV series, all the seasons put together. But because they are often conceived of as one-offs, because at least in the case of The Untamed and Word of Honor, they were adaptations from written work. They are a single cohesive, coherent, single story in this very protracted format, which just allows that. There was so much going on when the first time I watched some of these shows, and so much that it's hard. Yeah. You asked me, like, how can we talk about what these differences are?
Yeah.
And the answer is, I don't really know, because part of it was, it's just more complex because it's longer. Part of it was also kind of going back to these philosophical themes. There was kind of background material to all of the storytelling that was new to me. But there's also something about kind of the narrative arc and the narrative structure, where what I found watching some of these for the first time is like all of my narrative intuitions that I have honed from reading Western fiction and watching Western TV just didn't. They were of no use. And so you get about like 15 episodes in and you're like, I literally do not know how the bits are going to unfold. If this were storytelling in another narrative tradition, then all of this foreshadowing and significant things that I'm seeing, I can kind of predict how it's going to go. And with these, like, up until the very final episode, you are sitting there, it's like, I do not know how this is going to get wrapped up. And yeah, so this also makes these series really benefit from rewatching. So I'm now through my third rewatch of The Untamed. I've convinced my husband to watch it with me.
Yeah.
And with the first time through, you're just trying to figure it all out. And it's like, clearly at some point in the story, something goes wrong, but I don't know what it is. So the second time through I'm watching, it's like, okay, can I identify, like, where is the fork in the road? Where is the point at which everything falls apart? And I watched with that, and it's like, okay, I think it's this particular, it was this. If this character hadn't done that, the story would have been different. And now, as I said, I'm on my third rewatch, and just last week I revised my hypothesis. I now think that the event where everything started going wrong actually happened earlier.
Interesting. I was thinking of what strikes me as an inadequate way of talking about these differences. One that came out of discussion after the HBO adaptation Game of Thrones in its final seasons just like went really downhill from the Song of Ice and Fire. And I forget who came up with this distinction, but they were talking about psychological novels and television series and sociological. The idea being that psychological is what we're used to with Hollywood. A lot of emphasis on the individual character and their development and their arcs and all that kind of stuff. And it's kind of what writers know how to do. And then sociological stuff would be more like the actual Song of Ice and Fire or Frank Herbert's, Dune stuff, or, I mean, arguably even like Le Guin's Earthsea to some degree. You see a lot of, in her world building and very sparse prose, developing interesting things that have to do not just with like individuals primarily, but with like what's going on in entire cultures. And Hollywood writers are terrible at doing that. They don't think that way. They don't know how to do that. But it seems like, okay, that's an important layer, but it doesn't capture whatever we want to call the philosophical engagement, depth, the fact that it's not just about like long traditions or power structures or history, but it's also about certain important ideas and ways of approaching things, having a kind of sway in there over generations, maybe even over millennia, and again, I don't have a good term for this myself, but
yeah, this kind of, say, maybe movement away from the individual, and it's not just kind of, are we focusing on individuals and individual character arcs and development, or are we focusing on like society level stuff? Because that is
you're not going to do really good fiction if you don't have characters in it. right?
Yeah, it's more about kind of like what is the impact of this of these societal things on the individual.
Yeah.
And that's something that these super long forms, maybe it is just because they are longer that they have more context that they can develop in that. But it's also possible to write very long fiction that doesn't engage with those things.
Yeah.
So length is not the only determiner.
Yeah, I mean, I was just thinking that you could write a 10 book, each book being 1,000-page long series, but if that first book doesn't actually hook people in and have them caring about what's happening, whether intellectually or emotionally or however we want to think about it, nobody's going to read the rest of the series. And you could write a lot of stuff and it could all just be not very good at all,
Yeah.
I think we're talking about the ones where it really does work. But it's sort of like the issue that we have in philosophy, where people are like, well, who's a philosopher? Who's not? Who gets to call themselves a philosopher? And it always turns out that either it's about like a very parochial conception of philosophy, where you're belonging to this club and not that club, or philosopher is being used as a value term rather than a descriptive term.
Yeah. So I really like that question, but for my kind of specific area of research, which is, what makes a logician? Who gets to be a logician? Who gets to be counted as a logician? Who has been counted?
Okay.
Because I did my dissertation on medieval logic, and I did say I would comment on that intersection. So I got involved in a medieval reenactment society when I was a teenager, which I'm still a member of. Still dress up.
Which one is it? Is it the SCA?
Yes, it's the SCA.
Oh, you must have loved Madison then.
Oh yeah, it was fantastic. It's a great group there. I still have friends who are active in the SCA.
That's so cool.
But anyway, I had done this since high school, and then at some point early on in my PhD, I was taking a history of logic class. And about 5 weeks in, we hit the Middle Ages, and I'm like, wait a minute, they were doing cool modal logic in the 13th and 14th centuries? Well, that's my dissertation sorted. I know what I'm writing on now.
Yeah.
And so that was a very unexpected kind of collision of different interests. But since then, I've done a lot of work on medieval stuff. I've also kind of moved into the 19th century, but I've been good for 10 years now, been interested in the question of just generally women in the history of logic.
Yeah.
So it's very easy to give bad answers to questions about who are the medieval women logicians in such and such historical period. Because, lots of people look to the Middle Ages and are like, oh, well, where are the medieval women logicians? There aren't any, because logic was something that you did at university, and universities were not open to women. Therefore, there weren't, you can create these lovely little syllogisms, which are false. Because you have to first ask the question of, okay, who are we going to count as a logician? And you can kind of have various grades. So it's like people who wrote theoretical treatises that have the word logic in the title. If you did that, you're a logician. But it could also be people who were teaching logic. So plenty of people in the Middle Ages were teaching logic to undergrads, but maybe didn't necessarily write anything. Or maybe they only wrote a textbook. Okay, so maybe they count as logicians. Well, what about all of the people who were actually taught logic? Do they get to count as logicians? Is learning the techniques and the vocabulary and then maybe going off and maybe using it in other contexts, maybe not. Is that enough? And, if you get to a point where you want to say, there is argument for admitting in the people who have learned logic and use the tools and the vocabulary in non-logical contexts, then you have to address the question of, okay, who gets access to this knowledge? Who gets access to the education?
Yeah.
And then that will guide where you are going to find, where there will be women who get to count as logicians and where not. So these are the sorts of questions that I spend a lot of time thinking about, and increasingly, are trying to push my students to think about. So, by the time that they have already gotten into the first lecture of an introduction to logic class, they may not know anything about logic, but they already know far more than somebody who doesn't necessarily have this opportunity, because they knew enough to know that logic was a class they wanted to take.
It's interesting when you think about the Middle Ages. So, we have this rise of the university system and scholasticism in what we typically call the High Middle Ages. And, it's sort of like we tell a story where really cool stuff happens before that, and then we just ignore all the continuations of that. And I'm thinking specifically about monastic authors because, it's not as if they just quit teaching at the monasteries just because you could go to a university or because the Dominicans had opened houses of studies or something like that. And so, it's unfortunate that we don't have much from her, but you think about Eloise, she's an abbess. And one of the cool things about being an abbot, it seems like the priors would do much of the curricular organization and stuff like that. But, you're the abbot or abbess, you call the shots. And so you decide what people are going to study.
Yeah.
And
you have a huge amount of influence.
Yeah. And so if you're an Eloise or you're a Hildegard, you're not going to have your nuns learning this stuff. It beggars the imagination. But I think so many people, their ideas of the Middle Ages, once they get past there was a crusade or two, and then, jousting, and they actually start focusing on intellectual life. I'll actually just say it this way. There's too much emphasis given to the university and scholastics to the detriment of other modes and locations of education that were taking place all the way up to, it's still going to some degree. It's still going on. We have colleges that at least have a monastery attached to them where the monks do some of the stuff. Now, granted, in most cases here in the United States, they've been pretty sidelined, just because of what's happened in Catholic higher ed in general. But, arguably it continued on as a place where people could learn things well into the industrial age, Yeah.
It's important that if we kind of narrow things down to it depends, whether you get to count as a logician or not depends on your access to education, that we then don't take a very narrow view as to what's going to count as education.
Yeah. Yeah. Actually, I wanted to ask you something too about the 19th century. And I don't have the sort of background that you do. I was quite interested in logic and stuff when I was an undergraduate because it was a nice confluence of philosophy and mathematics. And I recently had a client who was very, very interested in logic, and he kept on sending me all of these essentially textbooks from the 19th century, some from the 18th century. And he's like, I want to work on logic. And he would just grab stuff at random. And I noticed looking through them that the sort of history that we get of it, if we get any, tends to be, there were these medievals, and they did Aristotelian logic, and then in the 19th century we figured out that logic could be done better, and we started figuring out how to formalize it and all that. And you're like, well, that's one thing that happened, but there was all sorts of stuff happening, and it's clear that these writers did not have the same conception of logic. Putting aside all the Hegel inspired stuff where it's its own weird, wacky thing, just, in French and English stuff, they didn't, some would be like, it's the laws of thought, and others would be like, no, it's this, or it's this, or it's this. And so I'm wondering, we teach it as a unitary discipline. It's logic, right? And, over there, they call mathematics maths, which I like, because over here we present it as if it's one unitary field and everybody's doing exactly the same thing. But it seems like logic would do better to be understood as one discipline, but it's a plural discipline with all sorts of interesting things happening within it that may not all be entirely compatible with each other, rather than, the way that we teach it in textbooks, which is, start out with this, then this came, let's do some Aristotelian logic first, then we'll do some formal logic, and then
tables, and then some
and then maybe we'll do some non-standard logics later on or something like that,
Yeah. Well, there's a reason why the intro logic class that I teach is called Fundamentals of Logics rather than of Logic.
Interesting.
Because there are so many kind of different things that I want them to get. First, there is, as you've said, within the kind of Western, Anglo-American tradition of logic, going back to Aristotle, even within that, we don't have, we haven't always had consensus about what logic is or what it is about or what it is for. The 19th century is a very good example of that, because there are so many, even amongst a very small community, so many kind of competing ideas and proposals being put forward. But there are also, if you take just sort of symbolic approaches to logic, that is the modern inheritance.
Yeah.
Within that, you've got classical logic, you've got intuitionistic logic, you've got substructural logics, you've got modal logics, you've got all of these different systems. And maybe we don't necessarily want to be pinning everything on classical propositional logic. Maybe we should look at other tools that we have. But again, I also want my students to be thinking about, okay, so, what has been called or considered logic or played the role of logic across different cultural contexts and disciplines. Yeah. And this is why, in addition to doing some syllogisms and propositional logic and predicate logic, because these are like the basic tools that you need if you are kind of doing philosophical work. We also look at the Buddhist tradition in logic, which has a very different role that it plays compared to what Western logic was developed for, but nevertheless is zeroing in on the same sorts of key features. It is when there is an idea that there are good arguments and bad arguments, and that good arguments can be identified on the basis of structural properties that they have. Even if these structural properties are entirely different from what we might be identifying in, say, like propositional logic, it's still the same sort of intellectual endeavor, which I think is really, really interesting for students to see. So I don't teach the class as a history of logic class because that isn't what it is. Nevertheless, we do, after some opening stuff, we start with Aristotle, and then we look at how did the Stoics, what were the Stoics doing when they developed? How are they reacting to to those developments? How do we see this kind of propagating through the Middle Ages? Where are we getting our modern developments from? Simply because I don't think that you can really properly understand where we are nowadays if you don't know how we got here. And so there is a huge amount of history that goes into that class, even though it's not a history of logic class.
Are the students getting that there is this complex, rich history? I mean, you think about what you can actually pack into 15 weeks. I mean, we're always constrained by this. I mean, we never actually get 15 weeks between various, days off or things like that. It's such a challenge to get the students to see what we can see and what we're excited about. I mean, I know that I give my students more resources in the background, like in the course management system, than we're actually going to discuss in class. And the motivated students will check them out, and then the rest will, it'll just, they'll ignore it. How do you actually do that pedagogically in your classes, and how they're set up? And
yeah, well, so one way I do it is I've got the primary text that I have is the textbook that I'm writing. The chapters that I teach from regularly are mostly complete, and so they they don't change very much, and so that's a nice kind of fixed thing that I can give them. But for every week they've got a set of problems, a problem set to work through, and quite regularly that will come along with, okay, go and read some of the primary sources. So at some point over the course of the year, they will be reading a section from the prior analytics to see exactly how Aristotle is talking about syllogisms and the way that he is working through proofs and things like that. They read snippets of Stoic logic where you get to see them articulating different accounts of the conditional, conditions for the conditional. We will read a Buddhist text in translation. And so do my students come away with an understanding of kind of the broader historical context? How do you ever know what students come away with?
Well, they let you know like 5 years down the line when they send you a message and they said, I used this thing that I learned in your class. And you're like, pleasant surprise.
Yeah, you learned something. But I think it would be very difficult for them to get through the class and not have absorbed something about the importance of the history of the subject.
Something else that I wanted to get your take on, when I was an undergraduate, I was quite interested in logic and foundations of mathematics and philosophy of language and things all interconnected, and probably couldn't have given you a good summary of what I was doing or interested in back then, because the field is so vast. And then when I got to grad school, they made all of us take an upper level logic class, like a 400 level class. It was required for your classes as a master's student. And it was, there really wasn't much that wasn't in my classes before. I think we went a little bit further along, and we were all supposed to come up with a project. And I was very much into trying to think about Wittgenstein and what he had to say at the time. And I'd managed, I'd been in some logic classes, I tutored logic and with other students. And so the question that I sort of formulated for myself is, if logic is indeed supposed to be showing us what the laws of thought are, then it should, it's understandable that not everybody should get it immediately, but in theory, at least, everybody should get it. Every concept should be something that a person can, at some point in time, say, I understand, I can apply this. This actually makes sense to me. And yet we see that with certain concepts, like, hypotheticals, and how they get, defined in terms of truth tables. There's some students who are just like, I just do not get this. And you'll explain it to them a second time. And then they'll say, I still don't get it. And you could think of it like a winnowing process. So the first time you present it, like half the class is looking at you kind of puzzled. Well, why are these true if the antecedent is false? And you're like, well, we got to look at it this way and all that. And then, towards the end of the class, they're like, well, I don't agree with it, but at least I can
play along.
Right? Yeah. But, and so each time you explain it, there's fewer and fewer students who don't get it. And you might be lucky and have a class where everybody gets it. But you also might have 3 students who are like, this just doesn't make any friggin' sense. And why is it like this? And they sometimes get mad. And all you can do is just keep explaining it to them. And pretty soon you feel pretty helpless. And you start to, you're even like, well, is it really supposed to work this way? What's going on here? And so clearly the idea of logic as being something that's hardwired into our whatever we want to call them, our souls, our brains.
Mm-hmm.
That's wrong, because if it was that way, then they would get it at a certain point. And so I never came up, I had some sort of Wittgensteinian explanation having to do with language games that I don't even remember. So I'm sure it wasn't very good. But do you have any ideas about why it is that, here's another great example. Some people just cannot get the difference between soundness and validity,
Mm-hmm.
and you explain it and you explain it and you chart it up on the board, and it just doesn't click for them. And it's not to say that they'll never get it, but it just doesn't click for them while we're teaching them. Do you have any speculations on why this is? What's actually going on there?
Yeah. So interestingly enough, I just had a conversation with a student this morning about kind of different things that people think about logic. Are these the laws of thought? Is logic normative? Is it descriptive? And it's like I kind of want to sit between some of these answers. It's like, we can certainly use logic for descriptive purposes, but it's more than just kind of describing things. On the other hand, if anybody who wants to say that this is like, the normative account of like the laws of human thought, then you've got this explanatory gap of trying to answer why is it that we collectively are so bad at it. Even in the face of, explicit education about it. It's an uncomfortable kind of position to sit in, because I would like to think that with sufficient time and thought and instruction and effort that everybody will get it. But that isn't how it works. There are some people where, and at the lower level, but also at the higher level. So, I took a number of set theory classes, gainfully kind of worked my way through them up until one class on forcing, which was something I'd heard lots of people talking about. And I felt, if I'm getting a PhD in logic, I should at least know what this is, even if I'm never going to use it. And to this day, I could pull off the textbook that we used, open it up to the definition where I stopped understanding things. And it doesn't matter how many times someone would explain to me the countable chain condition in Ken Koonen's set theory book. I don't think it will ever make sense to me. And, the class that I was taking this in was being taught by my PhD advisor, who is a set theory expert and an amazing pedagogue. And so, like, if he wasn't able to do it, who else is going to have any hope? And even at the time, I remember thinking, it's like, this is very strange feeling. Like, why is this the thing that I'm stumbling on? What is the key that I need to unlock it so that it makes sense? And, obviously I never figured that out, but I think that that's probably going to be the case for lots of people, where there is, at one level or another, there's going to be a point where it's like, I don't have the key that I need to unlock this. And without unlocking it, I'm now just stuck.
Yeah. And I suppose with a lot of other things, when somebody doesn't get something, we can like bring up an analogy, or we can appeal to something else that they understand. Whereas some of the things that we deal with in logic, and maybe even less so when it comes to like mathematics, where we can like say, well, it's like what's going on in this other field. We're just gonna, just you got that, you can get this. With logic, we're ultimately reduced to because I said so, or because they said so. And that feels awful, right? Because that's not rational at all.
So in that, again, this is where the history comes in.
Oh, yeah.
Because instead of just saying, this is how it is, or this is, the convention, or, so-and-so said so, you can say a bit about why we came to this position, why this is the position that has been adopted kind of collectively by the field.
Yeah.
You can point to alternatives and be like, okay, so, an interesting example with this is existential import with the syllogistics. It's like, I don't have to say, because I say so, this is why terms have to be non-empty in the syllogistic. I can go back and say, in the context that Aristotle was working and the reasons why he was developing his syllogistic, working with non-empty terms was not something that fit within his use case. What we have recognized later on is that this is something that can generalize. We don't have existential import when we look at predicate logic. A very interesting question would be, go back to the syllogistics, drop existential import. How does this change? What is valid? What is invalid? What are the rules that we can, the conversion rules and things like that. So, yeah, that makes it a lot easier to kind of appeal to those, to not have to give that sort of answer. Another thing that I find very useful is, so I approach logic in a very kind of pragmatic way.
Okay.
It's a useful tool that I can do cool things with. And if I can do cool thing with this development, then great, I'm good. A lot of the kind of philosophical questions that can come along with various logical questions are often ones that just don't interest me because they don't impinge upon me as a practicing logician. So, possible world semantics for modal logic.
Yeah.
Metaphysicians really get kind of bothered by, like, what are these possible worlds? We're defining possibility in terms of possible worlds. Isn't this circular? And, if those questions interest you, great. Go off and talk about them in your metaphysics class. For logic, it's like, I can do cool things with dots and arrows that are illuminating in terms of helping me figure out what is true and what is not in particular modal systems.
Yeah.
What these dots and arrows represent is interesting, but it is not a question that has to be answered in order for me to be able to do the logic.
It's interesting.
Similarly, going back to some of the kind of questions that like an interest student would have, the material conditional, lots of students really struggle with that. And the two-pronged approach that I have for addressing those struggles, one is to be like, look, if we define it this way, then first of all, it gets the falsity conditions right. And that is something everybody agrees on. The truth, so we agree on this case is obviously false. There isn't agreement that the other cases are false. So let's just take a minimalist position and take them all as true. Because you know what? If we do that, we get really useful equivalences. Right. We can define it in terms of negation and inclusive or, which allows us to do interesting things with the way the English language works in some translations. So here's an argument. Maybe material conditional doesn't tell the whole story, but it does tell some story, and it tells it in a useful way that we can do neat things with it.
And it also allows us. Yeah.
And the other prong just is, look, I get your concerns. This is not an adequate account of conditionals in English. Here are all of the other approaches that people have tried to give, which build on this. Go off and take a look at them instead.
Yeah.
Anyway.
I mean, it seems like the taking a pragmatic attitude towards the material conditional. Today, we could also say, listen, you like your technology. It's all based on logic circuits. This is the way these logic circuits are defined. So you just got to suck it up and like it. Going back to the possible worlds thing, though, it's interesting. So I've got a conjecture here. And obviously, my little look into the world of philosophy is very, very small window. Yours, however extended, is also going to be. So we're all just kind of speculating here. But I remember when possible world semantics was really, really becoming a big thing. And I did encounter it in a metaphysics class with a guy who was an analytic philosopher. And so we read some Aristotle, then we read some Leibniz, and then it was all David Lewis and his followers. And over the years, I encountered it in a lot of places. I was never very attracted to it because I thought there were some problems with how it framed things, and I didn't see it as being all that helpful. But I saw that everybody else was really, really into this, particularly in analytic philosophy. And it almost, to me, it feels, and I'll just use the word feels there because I don't have any better basis than this. It's not like I've done a study of it, but it feels to me like there's two entire generations of people who were they came up in analytic departments. This was like a lingua franca that you had to learn and use for all sorts of things. It's used for discussing free will. It's used for discussing, what it was originally designed for, what is possibility, what is necessity, what is impossibility. It's used for all sorts of things. And it feels to me almost like there's a lot of people who their sense is, well, you just gotta use this stuff whether you like it or not because it's the way we do it. Just like as if we'd been around in the 1960s in France, we'd be basically stuck with being Marxists or existentialists or historians of philosophy or structuralists or whatever, right? It's just like the part of the background. And maybe 100 years from now, everyone will be like, yeah, that was cool when they did that stuff, but it's as dead as positivism is today,
Yeah. Yeah, it's, I think, kind of the tradition that you first encounter these things will kind of impact how you approach it and things. So I got into logic first and then kind of took some other philosophy, but was always very much, focusing on the logic, philosophy of language, analytic philosophy, philosophy of math, that sort of things. My kind of broader philosophical education is quite sparse, even though Madison's undergraduate requirements were pretty good in terms of forcing you to get some amount of breadth. But my graduate training was at the Institute for Logic, Language, and Computation in the University of Amsterdam. It's an interdisciplinary center that is kind of based between the Department of Philosophy and the Faculty of Sciences, where there's mathematicians, computer scientists, and other things. And for whatever reasons, I think kind of by accident of paperwork, I ended up, despite my very strongly philosophical background, on the sciences side. Okay. So I got, my formative training as a logician, as a practicing logician, as opposed to just a student, was in this sciences model where, because of the nature of the institute we were in, philosophical questions were certainly asked and discussed and everything, but there was also just this, a lot of the mathematical logicians or even the computer scientists were way over on the side where it's like these philosophical questions just do not impact on the work that I am doing as a computer scientist. So I'm just going to keep on doing my thing. And that really did have kind of a big impact on how I approach logic, how I use logic, how I teach it, that there are, these philosophical questions are interesting and they can feed into good discussions, but a bunch of them don't have to be solved before I go off and be a logician.
Yeah, I think that is a helpful approach. And I think there's a lot of that in philosophy where, well, if we haven't got this figured out, we're just at an impasse, no more thinking about it necessary. And it's interesting. I'll mention something that's kind of analogous to that. So you, I'm sure, got some of the same sort of stuff about digital natives and generations that I certainly did from the educational experts, the pedagogical experts, who were mostly boomers, and they told people in later generations, well, see, these students that you're teaching, they've been on technology their entire life. And you have to find ways to appeal to them. And if you're going, so here's the thing about videos. When I was first producing videos, I actually started with a series that was called Dr. Sadler's Chalk and Talk, because they were saying chalk and talk is dead. Lectures are boring. Nobody does that sort of stuff. It's got to be interactive, and it better not be any longer than 5 minutes, because students won't pay attention. And I was like, well, that seems like BS to me. And I just did what I was going to do, and it worked, right? Sort of like your computer scientists who are like, well, I don't know if this is actually philosophically, justified, but I'm going to keep doing what I'm going to keep doing, and we'll see what happens. And which I guess you could say is, it's not unique to pragmatic approaches, but that's certainly at the heart of it. Let's see what happens when we experiment. And not. There's this. I'm not a fan of John Dewey, because having gone to Southern Illinois University for grad school, you get force-fed a lot of Dewey, right? But I did like his phrase, "Don't block the road to inquiry." It's a nice catchphrase for describing, don't get in the way and then gatekeep and tell everybody else that until we've solved the hard problem of consciousness, we can't say anything about this or that,
Yeah, maybe we can set some of those questions aside and just be like, okay, suppose that either we solve them eventually in the future, or they are unsolvable, in which case, what's the point? Now, what other cool things can we be doing? It's interesting what you were saying about kind of the chalk and talk and the traditional lecture and things, because you can read kind of opinion piece after opinion piece, usually written by people who are not actually working in higher education, about the lecture is dead, and whatever they describe as lectures, I just never recognize it, because it's certainly not how I teach, and it's not how I was taught. So it's not just this kind of generational thing. And I do find, though, that when I teach logic, I very specifically don't use slides. I do it, whiteboards, so no chalkboards in the rooms that I'm in. And students often don't like this, because they want to have slides, they want to have recordings of lectures, they want to have all of this. But they usually kind of come around when I explain to them why I don't use slides for teaching this sort of content. The biggest reason is, if I have to spend the time writing things out on a board, it slows me down. And we need that slower pace in order to give students time to think about things, to come up with questions, to realize confusions, to zone out for a bit, and then still be able to come back in and not find the rest of the lecture completely gone. And if everything is already written up for me, I will not take the time that is needed. It's just impossible. The other thing is that I want to be able to kind of be, responsive and reflective to areas of student inquiry. And if I have pre-made slides, then this shoehorns me into kind of a linear path through the material. And sometimes a student question or something will be like, oh, I was going to do the topics in XYZ order, but in fact, I should do XZY so I can respond to that. And, we get through the same material, just now I don't have to flip forward a bunch of slides and then flip back, and that makes it all awkward. And the number of students who kind of by the end of the year have been I really appreciated this style of teaching, or every once in a while, students for the next class will be coming in as I'm still cleaning off the board. And I had one last term kind of look at that and be like, oh, I wish my teacher taught like that.
Oh, so, interesting.
Yeah.
With slides too, you're giving them a packaged product, which then they can just kind of scroll through at their leisure. And there is something, and I don't know exactly what it is, to them actually writing things down, from the board, that, I don't know, helps them sort through it in their head. I experimented when so this would have been around 2011, 12. And I'd studied all these different pedagogical approaches, in part because at Fayetteville State University, where I was working, they would, the Center for Excellence in Teaching and Learning would give you meals if you'd come in for workshops, and then they'd also give you like little mini grants if you'd apply it in your class. So I had this incentive for like learning all these different active learning things. And some of them, were useful, and a lot of them were much more limited in their usefulness than the people putting them forward would give you to think. So anyway, I'm teaching like intro to philosophy and ethics. And I tried doing like the flipped classroom thing. And my students basically revolted. And they were like, when are you going to lecture? We don't want to just be doing discussions with each other.
Yeah.
You presumably are the expert who we're paying to actually like teach this class. You don't have to just be like reading stuff at us, but you're the expert. So why the hell are you having us try to sort, out what Plato's saying together, At a certain point, they want, if they could just get it on their own with having BS sessions with their friends, there'd be no need for us.
Yeah. So. And this is something that I tell my students, because, they do have the textbook. It's freely available on my website. After the pandemic, there's now all of the YouTube videos, which kind of march through the content of the intro class very closely. So in principle, if you're highly motivated and you work well in that sort of way, you can go off and learn all of it. That's fine. That's great. If it works for you, do that. But I tell all of the other students, it's like, most of you are probably not the sort of student who can do that. You're not going to devote the time and effort and energy. It's much more efficient to come to class because presumably, like, the university thinks that I am added value. There's a reason I am here. And so, come to lectures and you will get something more. Whether this is the same content said in a slightly different way, or the third time, the fourth time that makes it finally click, or maybe it's a slightly different example, or seeing it worked through, in real time. But I often encounter people who are like, students go, I'm not any good at logic. And I always ask them, like, have you actually been in a context where someone was trying to teach you? Or have you made this decision about how good you are at logic in a vacuum? Or maybe by like flipping through one textbook and trying to work through it? Because until you've given yourself the opportunity to actually be taught, you don't get to say whether you are good at logic or not. Come and let me teach you, and then make a decision.
I mean, you're familiar with the American phenomenon of lots and lots of students saying, I'm just not good at math, and they treat it as if it's like a raw capacity rather than an entire set of skills that have to develop over time. And I gather that sort of excuse doesn't fly in a lot of other places where they're like, well, you just need to actually do some more work, and some study, and you're going to make mistakes, but you'll get better at it. Whereas I'm not even sure why we, and when I say we, I just mean some Americans, accept it as an excuse, and then also like foist it off onto students like, oh, well, you're not good at math. You'll be good at writing instead, or something like that.
Yeah. So with my advanced logic seminar, I did have this year, it was a slightly more flipped classroom than I have done before, in part because since my videos are out there, I know that, a large amount of students coming into my classes have already watched a bunch of them. And so I don't just want to get up there and say the same thing. I feel like I should kind of take advantage of that. And so, the kind of initial stages of that class were kind of, you turned up the first week and you'd all watch the first couple of videos. So I'm going to assume that you're continuing to do this, and I will build my class structure around that. But one of the things that as we moved on in this seminar that I was trying to emphasize is that learning happens at the very edge of understanding. And that, if you feel like you are coming to class and you're kind of out of your depth and you're sort of, in slightly deep waters and
Yeah,
you
yeah.
don't quite, it's like I would tell them explicitly,
That's where
this
you
is
want to be.
exactly where I want you to be.
Yeah, yeah.
Because if everybody came into the classroom and was comfortable with everything that I was telling them, then I'm not teaching you anything. And then I've calibrated everything wrong. I want us to be at the, on the edge of ignorance, because that's the only way that we can kind of continually push that boundary forward.
So there's like a sweet spot there. I'm kind of curious, and I want to be cognizant of your time, so I don't want to ask too many long questions. So when I first started producing videos, originally it was videos from a critical thinking class that I was teaching, and then I got the same sort of results when I was doing just lecture capture, plunking down a camera in my intro and ethics classes, and I would get a lot of these comments, and I'm curious whether you get them, where somebody would say, oh, this is really helpful because my teacher won't explain anything, or I don't understand what they're saying, or all they do is like read from the textbook and they don't help me out with this sort of thing. And my reaction was, well, I'm glad this is helpful for you. That really sucks that there's so many people out there that are teaching in a suboptimal manner. Let's just call it euphemistically. So do you get a lot of those comments as well on these logic videos?
This was something that really kind of surprised me was, as I was going through, I was trying to kind of recreate the relatively interactive lectures that I have when we're doing this in person. Yeah. So getting people to work through examples or to come up with suggestions. And so I, talking into the void would tell people, give it a go. Here's I've proven this syllogism for you. Here's a very similar one. Try proving it yourself. Put your answer in the comments. I was really surprised when people did. Like, they were watching the videos closely enough and taking them seriously enough that people were giving sample answers and asking for feedback. And other questions and comments that I've gotten have been, really kind of engaging with various things that I have been, questions that I've raised and topics. And some of the questions in the comments have been really insightful. And some of them have also been just like, it was really helpful to hear your explanation because the explanation that I got from my teacher didn't work. And sometimes this is because there are lots of people who are not very good at teaching or not very good at teaching logic out there. But sometimes it could be that their teacher is entirely adequate for like 90% of the class. But sometimes what you need to understand something is just somebody saying it differently.
Right. Yeah. Yeah, that's quite true. So to finish up, I did want to ask you, coming back to speculative fiction, you mentioned Robert Jordan's Wheel of Time and these very long Chinese narratives as well. Are there any authors / series that occupy? I won't ask like what are your favorite or something like that. Instead, I'll ask this: are there any that like live rent free in your head, where you find yourself unable to completely extricate yourself from them, and you're even like maybe you haven't worked your way through the entire series, and you're like, I wonder what so and so's doing right now.
Yep. Yes. So I will give the shout out to The Lord of the Rings because that was formative for me in my kind of fantasy development. I first read it when I was about 10. I read it once a year, every year for the next decade or so, and then about every other year for another decade after that. And I think maybe about 2 years or so ago, by now, I read it out loud to my daughter. It took us about 13 months to get through it, but that was an incredible experience because that book was written to be read aloud. Yeah. The prosody, the cadence, the structure, everything is just beautifully put together. So that was an absolute treat. The other one is the pretty much all of the work, speculative and non, by Madeleine L'Engle.
Oh,
so A Wrinkle in
interesting.
Time, A Wind in
Yeah,
the Door,
yeah.
A Swiftly Tilting Planet. People might have heard of those, but there are so many other books in, slightly, she's got essentially two different universes that have a couple of points of overlap, some characters that move between them. And they're so underrated. I hardly ever hear people, particularly in spec fic settings, talking about these books. And maybe it's because they are too religious, even though they're like weirdly not for how much they talk about God. Or maybe they're too 1960s or too American, I don't know. But they are, when I moved up to university, all of the books by Madeleine L'Engle came with me, even though I had limited shelf space. And again, I have just finished reading A Wrinkle in Time out loud to my daughter, and we are now doing A Swiftly Tilting Planet. And it is such a joy to revisit some of these from my childhood and to share them with her. More modernly, the River of Souls series, so originally published by Beth Bernovich, but I believe that she has re-released them under her pen name, Claire Odell. So you might find it under one or the other. The opening chapter of the first book in the series zeroed in on two young girls playing a word game. And there was just something about it where I was instantly hooked in that chapter and read the entire book and got to the end of it and came away with this sense of, but I didn't know that you could write books like that.
Oh.
And so It was both kind of the experience as a reader, but also like it was a wonderful experience as a writer to read it, to be like, oh, I can do these things. I could, just so many little bits that's like, but I didn't know you could do this. And
it's interesting that you phrase it that way, right? Because it's not just a sense of I could do it this way, right? It's one could do this.
Yes, that stories could be told in this way.
Yeah.
That was really kind of opening things up for me. Oh, I do have to mention two more things I've read more recently that I really, really recommend for kind of narrative structure and things like that. One is Natasha Pulley's The Kingdoms, which is one of the best time travel stories I've ever read. And the other is The Tatami Galaxy by, and I'm just going to look up the author to make sure I get it right, by Tomihiko Morimi. So it is again narratively fascinating because it's these four different streams, stories, threads that all make up one story, and there's so much flexibility in how you can read it. And I was very delighted because almost from page one, it's like, I want to read this as a love story. And you get all the way to the end, and it's like, I was totally able to read it as a love story, and that made me very happy.
Well, this has been a real delight.
It has been.
Yeah. So, and maybe there's some unexplored things that we'll chat about in a future conversation. But thanks so much for being generous with your time and thought. So obviously people should check out the YouTube videos, your blog. You've got a lot of other writings as well. People can go to your University of Durham site, which I'll link to below here, and get a good sense of the breadth of what it is that you're up to. I always like to, give guests the last word. Is there anything that you'd like to go out on for viewers, listeners?
Any last words of wisdom? Logic is really fun. It is full of puzzles and things to discover and things to work out. And when it works, it is such a rush. And this is something that I love kind of getting students hooked on, where they're like, you know, when I started doing this, none of this made any sense and I didn't get what I was doing, but through, you know, working hard and perseverance and revisiting the material and talking to me and asking questions. And then all of a sudden, when it all comes together, it's like, oh yeah, that was cool. So as I tell my students, logic is the most fun thing that you can probably do at 9 o'clock on a Monday morning, which is unfortunately when I teach this term.